Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here on this special day. I think it's a really great opportunity to talk a bit about my research. So my name is Dr. Susanne Börner. I'm Assistant Professor of Human Geography here in Birmingham, and I'm going to talk about navigating gendered restrictions of the home, the street, and the virtual. And my research is based on a project by fellowship that I just finished, a 3-year project carried out in Brazil with young people aged 12 to 18. It wasn't specifically centered on girls, but I think it's a quite important factor. And like the fact of being invited here today was really nice for me to kind of draw out more of my results focused on girls, because half of my participants were young women. And I researched with approximately 40 young people. The initial focus of the project was more centered on access to food, water, energy, and context of disaster risk. But actually, when I went to my ideas for the presentation, what I kind of found was also like a really big focus on mobility or immobility in everyday spaces and very gendered restrictions, but also young people's imaginations and adaptations. I'm going to say a few more words about methods in a second, but just to kind of mention that the project was started shortly before COVID, with like some in-person activities and workshops, but it was mostly carried out through WhatsApp, as you can see on the slide as an example of what we did. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a second, and the project was funded by the European Union as a Marie Curie Global Fellowship. The research area that I looked at is a place called Franco da Rocha. It's very close to Sao Paulo city in Brazil, in the urban periphery, and we have very intersecting challenges as well as intersecting participants, or like influenced by intersecting factors such as age, class, gender, ethnicity, and income, but also young people growing up in Franco da Rocha. They kind of grew up in an environment of different challenges, which are youth unemployment was raised as the main issue by the young people, but also crime. Obviously, there was the cost of living crisis, which kind of exacerbated resource scarcity. In the rainy season, there is a lot of disaster risk, as many housing structures are quite precarious. There's a risk of seasonal flooding and landslides. And most of the research was carried out in the times of COVID, which led to more restrictions that were COVID-based. And in addition to that, there was also the issue of very little leisure space, especially for girls. We have like a few football pitches for boys, but there was very little opportunity for young women to go out and do things, especially like in the more remote areas in the hills. So like my research was conducted more in central parts of the municipality, but also quite in remote areas in the periphery. So looking at quite different scenarios. I'm going to say a bit more about that in a minute as well. And also saying that restrictions in the everyday were also curtailed by flooding and landslide risk. So lots of restrictions, I think, on physical movement, but also social movement, as young people have often not even left the neighborhood or the city, even though it's like 10 kilometers from Sao Paulo city, but they have often not even gone there in person. And I'm going to say a bit more about that in a moment as well. So this all leads to also multiple stigmatization of young people and the multiple crises of the absence and precarity of public spaces, both inside and outside people's homes, especially within COVID. There were additional challenges also of being in overcrowded conditions in the home in terms of education, but also their free time. And also on the other end, like going out to the streets was quite an issue because young people, even women, were quite stigmatized as troublemakers and a threat to public security. So this kind of created different intersecting challenges, like I said. And this is why, from a theoretical perspective, and I just want to touch on this very briefly, how I want to look at this is kind of this interconnected aspect, what we call also like the nexus, and we use nexus framing. I know some of you present here do work with that concept as well. The nexus has been used also in terms of policy making or as a conceptual framework, but I also think it's a really useful framework to kind of look at knowledge generation, everyday practices, and especially young people as co-producers of knowledge, to understand how to negotiate these multi-scalar socio-political and economic and ecological challenges they live with. I mostly applied this concept to the disaster risk, risks, and security aspects, but I think it kind of links really well to mobility. This is why I want to kind of draw on of these aspects of these entangled challenges today. And also really important to say, I want to look at it from a perspective of agency and young people as everyday agents, and not only as vulnerable victims of their circumstances, but I really want to show how they also reshape and reimagine their everydays in the virtual, but also in the built environment. And so I work a lot with the idea of youth everyday agency, which is all about young people's engagement, their emotional relationships, but also their changing interactions with the everyday, and try to make visible what has been hidden. So it's often about the mundane, the lived experiences of everyday space we don't often really see, that are always present, but we don't really think about, reflect upon. So kind of trying to carve out like these hidden spaces that are always there, but we don't really look at, and kind of thinking about that from a perspective of agency. In terms of methods, I kind of mentioned that very briefly. The idea was to have a participatory project involving participatory mapping, youth-led walks and interviews, focus groups. Well, due to COVID, things changed a bit, so we had to do, like I mentioned, do a lot of activities online, also trying to be participatory in terms of maybe introducing different activities such as photos or videos. But we also had individual interactions, mostly by text message, which was preferenced by the young people. So which kind of limited us a bit in what we could do. But I think, and I'm going to show some material before that came out, I think we still have quite a nice array of kind of results and quotes and experiences of young people from the audios and text messages. So coming to the results and like looking back at the nexus, so what I really found was the entanglement of restrictions, for example, of insecurity, of immobility, but also gendered responsibilities. So what I found were really four main themes in my data, which was one, also the girls' fears and like gendered security and perceived lack of respect of in public spaces. I'm going to give an example of that as well in a minute. Then we also had the theme of limited everyday mobilities in terms of distance, time, but also fragmentation of transport, especially public transport, and monetary restrictions. And then, like I mentioned, the absence of leisure spaces for girls outside their homes. And we also had very gendered responsibilities in the home, and also the experience of young women with teenage pregnancies and motherhood. And all this, like I said, in a framing of COVID-19 restrictions, has obviously made the situation a bit more challenging. So when we think about immobility and COVID lockdown specifically, because it was when the project kind of happened, I think what was interesting for me to see that often, apparently, the mobility or immobility of young people didn't really change so much. So I put a quote on the slide, which is from one of the young women, age 16. And she actually said, well, due to COVID, nothing changed so much, because even before that, she didn't really go very far away. But when she went out or went somewhere else, which wasn't like in her neighborhood, she would normally go to see relatives or maybe to see a doctor, mostly in the region, and maybe sometimes in Sao Paulo, but this was quite rare. So in the end, she said for her, nothing changed really a lot, because she said she doesn't really go anywhere anyway. And I think this kind of perception of not going anywhere was also highlighted by another girl, because when we tried to do like a walking tour with them, and we said, well, take us to some places you normally go to, places you like. She said, like, where do you want to go? And she was kind of standing there and thinking, well, where are we going? What do you want to see? Because there's nothing to see. And I think this also shows kind of the tricky situation of exploring the everyday experiences, where often we are really interested as researchers in these everyday mundane experiences, like take me to the next shop, where do your shopping, where it's quite like sometimes challenging to get young people to kind of understand what we want. But also what came up again in the discussions, like really the absence of spaces where they could feel safe, but also where they were kind of allowed and welcome. I think like being welcome is a big thing as well, because young people did use some spaces, as you can see in the picture. The building in the background is like their high school. So they said they had like this vacant space next to the school, like there's some trees, so they get some shade. In the summer it can be quite hot, so it's really hard to find shady places, and it's really just too hot to be in the street. So some of the young people would just use the space during breaks, but teachers didn't really like that, and they would just send them away. And like I mentioned, even young women were kind of seen as not respecting the area, or neighbors were scared, or teachers were scared. And then again, we also had the problem that young women were often really expected to take care of their home chores and their siblings, so didn't really have any opportunity to maybe also go out and enjoy the environment. But also, no size fits it all, I would say. There's different peripheries in the periphery. I brought some pictures of places and people did use, some shopping malls in the center, but also challenges such as flooding, what really made it difficult for young people to go places they enjoyed. So they had different mobilities, but also sometimes very different hopes and imaginations. And whereas some young people didn't really know what they actually would want in terms of change, when I asked them, like, how would you imagine like a city for yourself? Some didn't really have any idea, because they said, well, how can we know what we want if we've never had it? Whereas some were a bit more creative and like wanted like a library, lots of cultural institutions like a cinema, which was accessible maybe at a lower cost, or where they were also welcome and not getting bothered by adults the whole time. So just briefly as well, like I mentioned, the big issue was also perceived insecurity in public spaces. In the center of town, there's an area where you can actually go. There's like some leisure facilities, but it's very far. Like if you live like in the more peripheral areas in the hills, to get there, you need a car, you need to take a bus, or you have to walk. It's not really easy to get to. And also apparently the first question girls get from their parents is, who are you going with? So I think not going on their own, it's really something, just this freedom of going somewhere. And again, one of them said, well, I don't really go anywhere. And if I go somewhere, well, it's better to take someone with me or go by Uber. So also this kind of perceptions. And when they went, like kind of thinking, well, nobody really respects us. There was a story of one of the pregnant young women who was kind of attacked on a train and almost thrown out. She said, well, I was glad I was there with my mother because she could help me. But what if I'd been there on my own? So kind of this perception that if they go, it's all very precarious, not only in terms of transport, but also how they're being treated, the conditions they maybe have to use. It's often very crowded. Like one of the pregnant ladies said, well, I wasn't even offered a seat. Maybe I had to almost stand up, and like kind of these issues that kind of creates a lot of challenges. But then also maybe there were some good moments and people related of being helped by neighbors, of kind of experiencing acts of kindness, especially this young lady who was pregnant to receive like free fruit from neighbors. So I think despite challenges, I think there were always people to help navigate them. As we're a bit short of time, I realize there's so much to tell. I'm just going to go a bit quickly through that now. But like I was saying, we don't want to just see vulnerability, but also reinventing. And I think especially reinventing of home spaces during COVID, where home spaces just became areas and arenas of martial arts, of music, of dance, and also interestingly enough, like maybe sports that were maybe more seen in the boys' realm, such as martial arts, for example, that some of the young girls like to practice. Or they also mentioned like, well, we had to do housework, but then we just put on the music and dance to it. So kind of this challenging also gendered roles through how they occupied the spaces and how they navigated kind of their free time with their chores, and kind of trying to make their environment also a bit there as a spaces of self-expression, but also of resistance. And the project in itself, I think, was a quite nice way to virtually explore also ways of escaping or reimagining, where we had some kind of nice discussion of like comparing spaces such as backyards. How do we use them in the UK? How do we use them in Brazil? And I think just having this self-reflection and new experiences kind of really enables young people to kind of also feel empowered and experience something out of the ordinary, to just kind of see how things could be. But then again, also when we think virtual, what springs to mind is really also using phones. And young people, due to the lack of other things to do, most of them did have phones in the end, and also thanks to COVID sometimes, especially the older ones, they just spend the whole day, like what to say, vegetating on the phone. I'm not sure if it's the right translation, but this vegetation sort of, kind of switched off mode, which isn't really challenging you, but kind of being just the whole day on the phone, but also using this as an escape, and sometimes also for education, or like watching maybe series on Netflix, but not only maybe anything for entertainment, but also for education. So some young people just really mentioned trying to learn about history or watching different documentaries about different countries. And then also like in this very precarious context, I think something that was really important to see that young people use a lot of humor, and they like sending like these emojis and things on WhatsApp. And it really showed like it was a strategy as well to engage with these topics, maybe to distance themselves emotionally as well, but also as a way to kind of create a more lighter discussion around different issues that were difficult maybe. But I think it's something maybe to discuss is how can we create strategies to actually engage in discussions about these topics that are challenging without minimizing or denying experiences, while also protecting young people's well-being and their mental health, and kind of making it an empowering experience. So something that I'm quite interested in also in relation to disaster risk. Hopefully having a publication coming out on that very soon. So if anyone's interested in more on learning on emotional resilience, I'm very happy to share. So yeah, and I think what's really important to bring out, and I kind of like the image of the tree as well, is kind of the growth that young people still have, and this kind of empowerment that also came out through the activities, because we kind of presented the research as part of university extension course. And especially the young lady who was pregnant, she was in the beginning saying like, well, can I actually participate? Am I good enough? But in the end, like doing that really empowered her to enroll in different courses, like on childcare and different things, education. So I think kind of seeing that this process of self-reflection also led to self-empowerment. And I think that we really see that young people found different ways to navigate very challenging and entangled restrictions at different levels. And they kind of managed to reimagine also places, and kind of some of them challenged their placelessness. Some had more issues with that. I think talking about solutions, I think we shouldn't over romanticize that it's easy. I think often like coming from issues to action, there's still a gap. I think also like in young people's imaginations, I think it really depended also like in which families they grew up in, whether they had family members who were empowering, that were like maybe role models. There were like two twins, like their mom was in an NGO, and they were like really good also at engaging with like different age groups and adults and being really kind of full on about their ideas. And others were really quite shy and had like issues kind of imagining and thinking ahead. So I think they were quite different experiences, but nevertheless, I think it really shows that young people kind of and young women manage to kind of show that by acknowledging their reality, validating the experience, also engaging with them, kind of really imagined spaces differently, and also managed to kind of navigate and reimagine their realities. So this is what I wanted to bring in, and yeah, hope that was interesting, and happy to discuss some of the things.